I'm talking about technology, and now it works, but we're in Vegas too, so technology has a little bit different implications. And everybody's watching you in Vegas perpetually, and that's nothing really new, but what's new is how the games are played. The interactions between individuals and the interactions between businesses and how they lure you in to spend your well-earned money is really nothing new either. But what is new is something that took place about 2 months ago. There was an underground tournament right here in Vegas that took place with the top poker players around the world that were invited, closed-door session. And they were playing against a newcomer. This newcomer went by the name of Labardus. Now, Labardus wasn't really a person. Rather, it was more of a construct. This construct that was built by professors at the University of Carnegie Mellon. And they had built Labardus to take on these players in a 3-week, heads-up, no-limit hold'em tournament. And it started off with no knowledge of poker whatsoever, but then by the end of the 3-week tournament, Labardus not only cleaned out the top poker players in the world, but it became smarter and smarter after every hand was played. More important than that, Labardus never rested. And it was one of those proving grounds for technology and artificial intelligence because artificial intelligence could always beat the best chess players. For the last 10 years, they could do that. But nowhere ever had anybody created something that was able to take on this many fundamentally challenging, dynamic ways to bet. It took into consideration the emotions of the players. It took into consideration the betting principles of the game. And it took into consideration how bluffs were made. So bluffing, interestingly, has a lot more to do with mathematics than it does with emotion. And the implications of this are much more profound than just a game being won by one of a fascinating array of machines getting smarter and smarter. In fact, the implications are for industries like ours that are highly emotional industries, where everything that we do and all the folks that we interact with are based on emotions. Because for the biggest purchase of somebody's life, negotiation and emotion take center stage. Now, as Burke had mentioned, one of the interesting things that I tend to focus on at Second Century Ventures and the National Association of Realtors is this idea of the ideas. Like, what's new in the industry? What's coming soon? And as Burke had mentioned, we tend to go through hundreds and hundreds of business plans leveraging the best technologies in the space, and those particular technologies are predicated on the notion of how to make your own lives better. And one of the things that I try to focus on is really 3 fundamental principles from the brokerage standpoint, and that is, how do you recruit the best agents, number 1? How do you recruit and retain those agents, number 2? And how do you maximize the productivity? And wondering if, speaking of technology again, if we could get some help here. Hey guys, I don't know if you have a better clicker or not, but I'll just tell you which slides to go on to next. I think we may have it now. There we go. So with that in mind, and with the idea of focusing on the key practitioners in the space, I wanted to take a step back for a second and focus on what you guys have accomplished here at Realty One. And being part of a number of franchises in the past, I've seen tremendous growth in the industry over the last 15 to 20 years. And you guys have built some really impactful technology. You've built a recruiting machine, and you've really innovated your own way of thinking because you've embraced technology. Now, there's a lot of old school agents and brokers that think that, hey, I don't really need technology. All the way on the other end of the spectrum, you have brokers that like to pretend they're brokers, but really they're running a technology company and they want to be a brokerage. And anywhere in between, you can maximize your profit potential. But one of the really cool things about Realty One and the growth rate that you guys have been experiencing with your now close to 9,000 real estate agents in over 18 states has been the fact that you've not only embraced this real estate technology and innovation, but you're starting to incorporate it not just with your consumers, but the interactions between you and your own real estate agents, which is really the new frontier in the space, and we'll get to that in a moment. So, I want to focus on 3 key points today on how to maximize innovation in your business. And the first key point that I want to hit on is the idea of following where the money goes within the industry. The second point I want to hit on is this concept of building on the technology trends. And the third is maximizing the ROI within those particular trends. When I first started in the real estate space, I started as a commercial real estate broker. And as a commercial real estate broker, you learn a lot of very interesting things. You learn that you list to live, and buyers are liars. And oftentimes, that doesn't really translate to the residential space. But you also learn that there's a couple of other dynamics at play that are largely based on numbers. And if one of the key trends that I'm seeing right now is that we're moving away from just what does the bedroom want to look like, how many bathrooms are there, we're looking more towards the actual numbers behind the transaction itself and building models that are competitive models at the local level that institutional players can actually leverage to compete against some of your local buyers and sellers. So when we look at the idea of why we all got into real estate, well, we all probably had a choice when we got out of school, and that was to pick one of the 3 major food groups to jump into for success: food, water, and shelter. That's what I was told by my mentors. I chose shelter, and the reason I chose shelter was because, well, it's a pretty massive industry right there. We have 136 million housing units, and 126 million of those are currently occupied. But when we're under this notion of how we follow the money, what I'm interested in is what's happening in this lower left-hand quadrant here. What's the outstanding debt available in this space? And what's the total equity amount that's locked up? Because really that equity is everything as far as how we perceive the transaction and how the market reacts back to us. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at what's gone on in the last year, in the last couple of years, in 2016, we had 5.7 million transactions, and that includes new home sales. But what's very interesting about this particular picture is that over the last 3 years, we've seen the average commission drop from about 5.5% to about 5.2% on these transactions. Now, why is that important? Well, I think you all know why that's important, because that affects your agent's bottom line. And if they can't survive because the commissions are being compressed, then obviously that's a massive hindrance on our business. But what else happens when the market gets good? What happens is we have a lot more licensees that come into place. At the National Association of Realtors, the realtor count from the downturn, which was around 900,000 realtors, now spiked up again to 1.2 million realtors. It's this idea that, hey, there's money in them there hills, right? But what happens is that unless you're good, and unless you make this a career, and unless you focus on this idea of per agent productivity, it's not a career, it's a job. And as brokers, we innately know that because we're constantly trying to recruit those best agents and keep them there. And if you do the math here, you find that, well, the total GCI earned throughout the country last year was around, call it $90 billion. That's pretty good, right? But in reality, the real money came from a lot of ancillary services and drove this number up to $127 billion. The ancillary services including MSAs, title, escrow, lending, other types of services that you may employ throughout the transaction. Now, what's fascinating about the revenue side, if we're following the money, is that, yeah, that's a lot of money, and that's, another reason to jump into this space. But in my mind, what's even more important is how we spend that money when it comes in. And when we look at the way that the brokerage operations are broken down throughout the United States, we see a couple of things. Number one, the profit margin is relatively skinny for most brokerage operations, between 5 to 10%. And we have the traditional personnel costs and lease utility costs, but do we know what the number one spend of all agents is in America, hands down, again and again? Anybody want to throw out a line item? No, it's not payroll. The number one thing that real estate agents spend their money on is their automobile. Year after year, that is the number one expense. The funny thing is that has little to do with interaction with the actual consumer. What's also fascinating is technology and marketing and advertising. Now, this is traditionally separated, but I think you're starting to see the blurring of the lines between technology and the marketing and advertising costs. And when we add up that 10% and that 3% for technology and marketing and advertising, that comes to about $17 billion worth of opportunity every year that we are spending our money on collectively as brokerages. So why is that important? Well, that has some pretty profound implications, because if that's where the money is going, that's really what makes a trend. And when we start talking about really interesting trends and observing these trends, we can look back and see, well, yeah, that seems about right. Trends are sort of an interesting thing that not only affect and impact brokers and agents, but they also affect the real estate consumers. Zillow and Realtor.com got in front of that trend with regard to the consumer by recognizing the consumer wanted a heck of a lot more from their real estate experience, by truly understanding, hey, what is my home worth? Can an experience online be a very high quality experience where I can gain additional information on my house or my neighbor's house, etc.? And Zillow had that concept of the Zestimate. And when that first came out, one of the number one things that was said about it is, that's wrong. Because what's the first thing we all did? We went in and we typed our own address in, and it was either too high or too low. But do you think Zillow cared? Absolutely not. It was one of the best marketing ploys ever. See, true innovation and innovation that moves an industry oftentimes isn't this crazy, wild, audacious, massive change that comes and plops and says, here I am. Instead, it's the micro improvements on the space. For instance, let's take your cell phone. This is a really, really interesting concept. And what's funny is that, actually, you'll get a kick out of this. I was talking to my parents the other day, and they were telling me about them growing up. They actually used the telephone to talk to each other. And now, for me, I see the telephone as a seldom used app on my phone. And if you use it on me, I'm upset. I'll be really upset. How dare you? How dare you use that telephone app on me? No. You text me first, and then you ask me if I have time to talk, and I'll text you back and see if you have time to talk, and then we'll set a time in a meeting. And it's pretty fascinating that consumers demand certain things that allow us to change and pivot. Consumers demanded music, their entire music jukebox, to be on their phone. And you look at that and you say, well, that's kind of strange. And no. The reality is they wanted all music anywhere that's ever existed to be available on their phone, and they wanted it for free. That's a pretty awesome concept when you step back and think about it. And the question now becomes, in our space, well, what are we going to want now? Are we going to want a lot of really cool things to take place in the context of the real estate space? Well, a lot of those cool things aren't really new. For instance, Siri was preceded by the HAL 5000. Virtual reality was preceded by this guy over here in the 60s. I don't really know what he was doing there. And Tesla never had anything on the Hoff. And everybody knows the best PDAs came from the Star Trek generation. So again, rarely is an idea new, but when it hits a market, it hits it based on these three pivot point questions. Is the technology ready? Is the market ready? And is the cost and accessibility ready for that particular market? And we see that when we start looking at the dynamic of the innovation cycles within real estate technology itself, where there's evolution, technology that implicates certain types of connectivity. So Realtech 1.0, for instance, as I call it, the evolution was the computing evolution. And the technology implicated was MLSs, the faxes, and the connectivity helped to foster better relationships from a broker-to-broker standpoint. And those particular relationships were based on information asymmetries, and profit was based on that information asymmetry. Then comes Realtech 2.0, which has a lot more to do with the information sharing. And this is where consumers start to get involved, and brokers are forced to start sharing that information with consumers. That was a wild concept at the time, and that was the advent of portals, cloud computing, and a lot of mobile technology as the basis of communication. And that was really the foundation of this idea of leads. Now we're going gaga over leads because, if you don't have leads, then you're missing out on the lifeblood of the industry. Well, now we enter Realtek 3.0, where the evolution is no longer information, it's a data-based evolution, where the technology that drives it is going to be things such as machine learning, artificial intelligence, and automation. And the connectivity isn't about the broker and the agent or the consumer. The connectivity is about the ecosystem, which is why I'm really excited about what RealtyOne is doing by connecting the entirety of the ecosystem together and allowing this technological innovation to come to you. And I'll get to some of the other dynamics of that, but the main implication for this particular technology cycle as data becomes more prevalent is that a lot of money chases data. How much money? Well, $2.7 billion flooded this industry last year specifically for real estate technology. And where did this money go? Well, it went to a lot of key investments, and these investments spanned commercial, residential, brokerage, etc. But all of these players are chasing that seemingly difficult to achieve IPO or buyout. Why? Because those buyouts are huge. And where's the money go year to date? Well, year to date, if you break it down, it's somewhat interesting. You had $50 million that was plowed into websites and back-end infrastructure this year. You had $33 million year to date that was plowed into big data specific to the real estate space. And when I say big data specific to the real estate space, I'm not just talking about your basic MLS information. I'm talking about behavioral dynamics of you, your agents, your consumers, your soon-to-be consumers, domestic players, international players, commercial players, title, escrow. How people behave is really where the new frontier in big data is. Then you have 34 million plowed into technology brokerages. These are the brokerages that are building their own applications or white labeling applications and trying to get a much higher valuation for those particular applications in order to justify a lot more money, which is a typical pattern that I find often in traditional Silicon Valley ventures. So you have a lot of these really interesting dynamics that come to bear on the industry, and it creates the opportunity for a number of technology players to jump into the space. And what's fascinating about a lot of these technology players is that many of them are shiny objects. Many of them are designed to take the money out of the pockets of your agents. And the challenge with that is the utility. Sometimes the utility is wonderful, but to put that into perspective, let me ask you all a question. How many of you used a macro the last 12 times that you opened up Microsoft Excel? Yeah. Very few, if not any. And the reality of that is that the macro makes up roughly 80% of the programming of Microsoft Excel, but nobody uses it. Oftentimes, we come across these great technologies, but your agents are only going to use roughly 20% of that particular technology. So my biggest challenge to you today is this idea of ROI. And I think we all know what our return on investment or return on spend should be, but what we should be focused on is the ROI from every time we make a technology-based decision. And this ROI doesn't necessarily need to be based on a specific cost parameter or spend parameter, because some ROI is based on things that are a little bit less tangible, like relationship ROIs or efficiencies or economies of scale that aren't immediately measured. But the idea of pushing for this ROI is challenging you to ask the question of every technology provider from the standpoint of what's in it for my agent, what is their return on investment? And if you look at like the construct of, let's say, Zillow and Realtor.com, because those business models are capturing the most spend of agents and brokers around the country year over year, the ROI on those when they first came to the market was about a 9 to 12 times ROI on every dollar that was put in. Now that's obviously predicated on how well your throughput systems are on receiving the leads, taking care of the leads and performing on the leads. But the reality is now is that organizations like Zillow have 85,000 realtors on their platform, and that return on investment is getting squeezed. It's getting squeezed dramatically. And it's much more highly dependent on how that real estate agent or broker handles that lead coming in, which is requiring additional new technologies to come to bear. And when you look at the overarching process of real estate and the transaction model itself, it really focuses on some pretty simple characteristics, but under the hood, there's a heck of a lot more. And the new technologies that are coming into our market are attacking each and every single line item within the technology transaction infrastructure. And it's only going to get more and more competitive because that trend is chasing that dollar. These companies are going to come up more, and as long as we're spending money on it, these companies are going to get bigger, venture capitalists are going to invest more, and as they invest more, you're going to have a couple of really sexy IPOs, and that will attract even more players, which forces you, the top performing brokers in the country, to be highly discriminatory on the technologies that you choose to deploy and introduce to your real estate practitioners and agents. But make no mistake, it doesn't stop here. The new technologies are going to be impacting the entire real estate ecosystem, from residential to property management to relocation, title, etc. And that's a good thing. But if we back up from everything just for a second, I would argue that the core technologies that are going to make the biggest impact on your business are technologies that focus really on three things. They focus on the underlying understanding of the dynamics that you have both with your customer as well as with your agents. They focus on the idea of automating some of those routine communications between your consumers and your agents. And finally, they focus on overlaying that with really key data that will enable you to make better business decisions. And that's really been at the heart of what we've tried to do at Second Century Ventures and with our REACH program that's now going on its 5th year. Each year we try to take in about 7 to 9 companies that will hopefully provide benefits for brokers and agents alike. For brokers, again, that intention of recruiting and retaining the best agents, and for agents, enhancing their productivity and enhancing them in terms of their expertise. Many of these companies have done phenomenally well. And as a matter of fact, because of its status within the real estate industry, it's one of the top performing accelerators in the world, with a very low fail rate of these organizations. But what I'm really excited about is this year. This year, we've sifted through a whole ton of technology and applications and came out with these top 7 that we announced just last week. And these REACH companies, just like most other companies, start with a very simple premise. And that premise is really, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve for the betterment of the industry? And it's a great question to ask. It's a question that all of us can ask in our day-to-day businesses, because that's really the underlying profit motive. Because if we can solve a certain problem and do it to where we can maximize profitability, well, therein lies the secret to business. And when we look at specific problems that are facing us right now in our industry, we see problems like, well, there's a lot of wire fraud that's happening at closing. People are spoofing emails and really attacking the underlying consumers. Those consumers who get an email that's spoofed from their title department saying, hey, here's the wire instructions for closing. Let's go ahead and get that ready and set that up to pay tomorrow. Well, there's been a number of potential home buyers, and I say potential because they oftentimes don't have insurance on this particular money, and they lose everything. There's been a number of recent cases just up in my neck of the woods in Silicon Valley where people have lost over $800,000–900,000 because of this wire spoofing. So, solution here, for instance, this year is we've brought to bear a company called Trusted Mail. And Trusted Mail is one of those very interesting companies that uses and leverages biometric information that's stored in the blockchain and uses facial recognition in order to verify email transactions for the most important transaction of an individual's life. Another problem that we're seeing in the industry is this idea of taking an agent's innate tacit knowledge. And when I say tacit knowledge, it's the knowledge you gain over a period of time. Every year, agents go through literally hundreds of houses, open house tours. But how often do they act on that? Or more importantly, how often are they able to even share that information with other agents, brokers, consumers, in order to enhance their own brand? Well, we figure that's a pretty big challenge in the space because that restriction on showcasing those talents really delegitimizes the strength of a given agent or broker. So one of the solutions that we saw fit to include in our class is Relola this year. And Relola does a pretty good job of helping real estate professionals unlock property insider information with tools that digitize and help to amplify their everyday tasks and lives. Another problem was accuracy and predictability of the home's value. This is something that's not new, and I think that we can all agree that's one of the fundamental challenges that we've all had with some of the portals at one point in time or another. And that is having to deal with a consumer that's saying, well, you want to price my property at this, but Zillow, Redfin, et cetera, they're telling me my property should be priced at this. Well, to help solve that problem, we've focused on a company called House Canary, which is backed by Eric Schmidt. And his whole challenge and his whole thesis really is that data itself is going to be the new digital currency. And House Canary has done a wonderful job with providing institutional level quality of data to some of the biggest tech firms and banks in the world, and now they're going to start bringing it to the real estate space. Another problem is finding a notary 24/7 to close a deal. It may seem like a small problem, but depending on the number of transactions you or your agents are performing per year, it's actually a massive problem. So we've brought in a company called Notarize. And Notarize does just that. They provide a notary 24/7 to close a deal. And how do they do it? All online. You can do it via your cell phone or via your laptop computer or desktop computer. Pretty great technology, but what's under the hood is something even more sophisticated that, again, uses the underpinning data and the blockchain to store this information to verify the trustworthiness of the individuals that are signing on the notary. Another problem is transferring the knowledge of a home from buyer to seller. And the knowledge of a home after living in there for a period of time, whether it be the knowledge of when the last time you changed the air filter or updated your HVAC system or replaced the roof, or maybe learned about a warranty malfunction with a washer and dryer. Well, that's a huge problem, and we feel that that's solved by a company called Centric that is really transferring home organization, repair, and maintenance knowledge from the seller to the buyer. So all of these organizations are doing some really cool things, but again, it's predicated on this idea that there's a problem that brokers and agents are explaining that need to be solved. And there's money available, as we know. But we can step back and say, how do we get better at our business? And how do we innovate together? And I'd say that the ways to do that are first and foremost following where the money's going in our industry. Secondly, being aware of the trend, being aware of where that money is chasing these trends. And finally, pushing for the ROI, pushing to help solve these particular problems. And for those of you in the room, if you want to become early adopters or get a first look for free at some of these products, go to narreach.com/realtors. We have an insight panel as part of our accelerator program that allows you to be the first movers on this technology to provide your candid input on how they can improve it for your benefit. But the idea of the artificial intelligence machine changing the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis, it'll never replace us unless we allow it to. And if we take the position and the attitude that artificial intelligence is here to help us out and is a tool for us, and we continue to embrace what's coming and embrace some of these trends, then that's the attitude that will allow you to continue your existing success and propel you above and beyond the productivity levels of the average realtor around the country. Thank you.